Look around the world today and you'll notice something immediately. Human beings come in an extraordinary range of skin tones, from extremely dark brown to extremely light skin, with countless shades in between, and yet all of humanity comes from the same human origin. The people living in Scandinavia, Nigeria, Korea, Peru, India, Australia, Morocco, or anywhere else on Earth are not separate kinds of humans. They all belong to the same human family. So how did one human family eventually develop such an enormous variety of skin colors? The answer has a lot to do with something surprisingly simple: sunlight. But before we get there, we need to clear up one important point. We cannot state with certainty what exact skin tone the first humans had. There is no reliable basis for confidently assigning them one of the modern racial categories we use today. And that's important, because categories like white, black, and Asian are modern ways of describing enormous and incredibly diverse populations. Human pigmentation is much more complicated than 3 boxes. What we can study, however, is how pigmentation works, how it is inherited, and why certain pigmentation traits became more common among populations living in different environments. And that story begins with melanin. Melanin is one of the main pigments responsible for the color of human skin. Generally speaking, the more melanin present in the skin, the darker the skin appears. But melanin isn't just there to create different colors. It also performs an extremely important job. It helps protect the skin from ultraviolet radiation. Sunlight contains ultraviolet radiation, usually shortened to UV, and excessive exposure to UV can damage cells. Melanin absorbs and disperses part of that radiation, acting almost like a biological layer of protection. You can think of it as a built-in defense system. Not an indestructible shield, obviously. If you stand outside under intense sunlight for 6 hours because you decided sunscreen was a government conspiracy, melanin is not going to magically negotiate with the sun. But pigmentation does influence how the body interacts with ultraviolet radiation. And this becomes extremely important when human populations live for many generations in environments with very different amounts of sunlight. Near the equator, UV radiation tends to be intense throughout much of the year. Farther away from the equator, especially at high northern or southern latitudes, UV radiation can be considerably weaker and can vary dramatically depending on the season. That creates a biological balancing act. On one side, too much ultraviolet radiation can be harmful. On the other side, sunlight also helps the human body produce vitamin D. Vitamin D plays an important role in bone health and many other biological processes. So the human body is dealing with 2 competing needs: protection from excessive UV radiation, while still allowing enough UV exposure for important biological functions. And this is where differences in human pigmentation become fascinating. As generations of humans spread into different regions of the Earth, they encountered very different environments. Some lived in areas with extremely intense sunlight. Others lived under skies where strong sunlight became much less common, especially during winter. Some populations lived at high altitude. Some lived near coastlines. Some relied heavily on foods containing vitamin D. Others had diets providing much less of it. Over long periods of time, inherited pigmentation traits became distributed differently among different populations. In regions with intense ultraviolet radiation, higher levels of protective pigmentation could provide important advantages. In regions with weaker ultraviolet radiation, lighter pigmentation could allow ultraviolet light to penetrate the skin more efficiently, helping the body produce vitamin D under conditions where strong sunlight was limited. Generation after generation, these inherited differences accumulated, and gradually, different populations came to display different average skin tones. But here's where the story becomes even more interesting. There wasn't just one genetic route to lighter or darker pigmentation. Different populations sometimes developed similar visible characteristics through different combinations of genes. Europe gives us one fascinating example. Ancient DNA shows that the people who lived in Europe thousands of years ago did not necessarily look like modern European populations. Certain ancient European hunter-gatherers appear to have possessed combinations of pigmentation traits that would seem unusual to people today. Some individuals, for example, may have had relatively dark skin pigmentation, while also carrying genetic variants associated with light-colored eyes. In other words, the familiar combinations of skin, hair, and eye color we associate with modern populations did not simply appear all at once. They developed and spread over long periods of time. As populations moved, mixed, became isolated, changed their diets, and lived under different environmental conditions, the frequency of pigmentation-related traits changed as well. Eventually, lighter pigmentation became widespread throughout much of Europe. But Europe was not the only place where lighter skin developed. Populations in East Asia also came to have lighter average pigmentation than many populations living closer to the equator. And here's the fascinating part. Some of the genetic variants involved are different from those that became common in European populations. Similar visible result, different genetic pathways. It's almost like two engineers being given the same problem and independently designing two different machines that accomplish a similar task. The outcome can look similar even when the biological root is not identical. And this is why dividing humanity into a few simple color categories doesn't really work. Skin pigmentation exists on a continuum. There isn't a biological line somewhere on Earth where suddenly one race ends and another begins. Travel gradually from one region to another, especially before modern mass migration, and human characteristics historically tended to change gradually as well. North African populations do not have exactly the same pigmentation patterns as populations from equatorial Africa. Southern European populations are not identical to Northern European populations. People from the Arabian Peninsula, Central Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, Oceania, and the Americas all have their own complex histories. And even inside the same population, individuals can have noticeably different skin tones. Human pigmentation is messy, but that's exactly what we should expect from one human family spreading across an enormous planet, living in different environments and mixing in different ways over countless generations. There's another important piece of this puzzle. Skin color is not controlled by one simple skin color gene. Many genes influence pigmentation. These genes can affect how much melanin the body produces, what type of melanin is produced, how pigment is distributed, and how skin responds to sunlight. That means two people can have similar-looking skin tones while carrying somewhat different combinations of pigmentation-related variants. It also explains why children within the same extended family can sometimes have noticeably different complexions. The genetic system underneath human pigmentation is much more complicated than the labels people put on top of it. And this brings us to perhaps the most important part of the entire story. The differences are real, but they are differences within humanity, not divisions into separate human origins. Every person alive today belongs to the same human family. Dark skin does not represent one kind of human being. Light skin does not represent another. And everything in between isn't a collection of separate human categories either. They're variations. Different combinations of inherited characteristics appearing among the descendants of the same human origin. That perspective completely changes how strange our obsession with skin color can sometimes seem. Humans often pay enormous attention to tiny visible differences. Skin tone, hair texture, eye shape, hair color, facial features. Yet underneath those visible differences, the basic biological structure of humanity is remarkably consistent. Your skin may contain more melanin than someone else's. Their ancestors may have lived for generations under very different levels of ultraviolet radiation. Your families may have traveled along completely different paths across the planet. But none of that changes the fact that you're both human beings, belonging to the same extended human family. And the modern world has made the picture even more complicated. For most of history, geographic distance limited how frequently distant populations interacted. Today, people can travel from one side of the planet to the other in less than a day. Populations that remained geographically separated for enormous periods of time now live in the same cities, marry, have children, and combine genetic histories that may once have developed thousands of kilometers apart. So the already enormous spectrum of human pigmentation continues to produce new combinations. Which means asking, how many human skin colors are there, doesn't really have a clean answer. There aren't 3. There aren't 5. There isn't even a meaningful biological list. There is a continuous spectrum created by genetics, inheritance, environment, migration, and human history. And perhaps that's the most fascinating thing about the entire subject. Human skin tells a story. It can carry traces of where generations of someone's ancestors lived. How much sunlight existed in those environments? Which populations encountered one another? Which pigmentation variants became common? And how families moved across the planet over enormous stretches of time? But none of those differences changed the beginning of the story. Humanity has a common human origin. Then came generations. Families became communities. Communities became populations. Populations spread into different environments. People moved, separated, reunited, and mixed. Inherited characteristics appeared in countless combinations, and over time, humanity came to display the incredible range of appearances we see today. So why do humans have different skin colors? Not because humanity consists of fundamentally different kinds of people, and not because one skin tone represents a more advanced or superior form of humanity. Skin pigmentation is simply one of the many forms of variation found within the human family. Different environments, different inherited traits, different population histories, different amounts and combinations of melanin. One humanity, countless shades. And the next time you look around a crowded city and see people whose ancestors came from completely different parts of the world, remember what you're actually looking at. Not separate human origins, not separate species, but different branches of the same human family, carrying visible traces of generations of human history on their skin.